Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the United States Institute of Peace. I'm Steve Hadley. I'm chairman of the board of the Institute. We're going to get started. The intelligence we've received is that there are power outages and metro slowdowns and all kinds of chaos, which some would say made it a typical rush hour in the Washington morning, but we're going to pass that. So people will be joining us as they're able to get here. But we're glad that you are all here. This is the fourth event in the Iran Forum, which is a series that has been co-sponsored by 8 Washington think tanks. They are the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the RAND Corporation, the Arms Control Association, the Center for a New American Security, the Stimson Center, Plowshares Fund, and the Partnership for a Secure America, which I think is really an unprecedented collaboration, and I want to pay special thanks and tribute to Robin Wright, who has put this consortium together. This event is also brought to you by the Iran Primer, which is USIP's comprehensive website with resources on every Iran-related subject you can think of and analysis from almost any angle, and I would urge you to take a look at the site. We will have provided a copy of the Iran Primer homepage on every seat here, and if you don't have one, you can get one in the back. We're delighted to host this original forum involving both former American and Iranian officials who understand firsthand the challenges of foreign policy and particularly U.S.-Iranian relations. On April 2nd, the world's 6 major powers and Iran announced the framework for what could be a historic nuclear deal. The terms remain controversial and somewhat disputed in both capitals, and our goal today is to explore the challenges ahead. Let me quickly introduce our panelists. You should have the full bios of these candidates at your seat. But let me introduce them briefly, starting from my right. Ali Akbar Mousavi, former member of the Iranian parliament from 2000 to 2004. He was arrested while demonstrating to support equal rights between men and women in June of 2006 and was released 130 days later. He moved to the United States in 2009 and is a visiting fellow at Virginia Tech and a human rights and digital freedom advocate. Welcome. Nice to have you with us. Next is Jim Slattery, a former congressman from Congress from 1983 to 1995, and currently a partner at Wiley Rhine LLP. He is the first former congressman to visit Iran since the revolution and attended the World Against Violence and Extremism conference in Tehran in December of this last year. He's been involved in interfaith dialogue with Iran for about 10 years. Jim, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Next is Michael Singh, former Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council from 2005 to 2008, and currently a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. During his tenure at the White House, Michael was responsible for coordinating U.S. national security policy toward the Middle East, including an emphasis on Iran's nuclear and regional activities. And as National Security Advisor, I did whatever he told me to do on the subjects on which he worked.
That's not how I remember it.
Welcome, Michael. Next is Howard Berman, a former congressman from California from 1983 to 2013, and currently a senior advisor at Covington and Burling LLP. As chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Berman was one of Congress's leading experts on international relations. Howard, great to have you with us today. So with that, we are going to begin. We are going to go probably till about 10:30, maybe 10:35 or so, given the late start, with a conversation among us up here. And at that point, we are going to open it up to questions. There will be microphones. Please wait for a microphone to come to you. Identify yourself and ask your question, and you can direct it to any of the panelists or all of the panelists as you seek fit. So let me begin, if we can. As I mentioned in the opening remarks, there seem to be various versions about what has been agreed so far in the negotiations. We've also heard from Iran's supreme leader about some of the objectives he has in the negotiations about prompt sanctions relief and no access to military sites, and a couple other details, which are not fully consistent with what the U.S. side has said. So in light of the somewhat disarray about what has been agreed so far, let me ask the panel two questions. First, how close are we to an agreement? And how likely are we to get a final signed document by June 30? And if I might, Ali Akbar, let me begin with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. At first, I would like to thank these organizers, especially USIP, for convening this timely event. And also, I would like to emphasize that I'm not representing any organization and other, the people or group of people. I'm just talking on my behalf, my personal opinion here as a former member of Iran's parliament. Regarding your question, I think we are very, very close to a historic moment, historic achievement in solving a big international crisis peacefully and diplomatically. I'm very optimistic to reach this moment very soon. I even couldn't imagine 2 years ago to see such a rate of progress. I remember that 2 years ago we sent a letter as 7 former members of parliament to 3 leaders, the Supreme Leader, President Obama, and Ms. Catherine Ashton, and proposed this deal. It was almost about January 2013, and we had lots of difficulties to even initiate, to talk about and convince many experts in Washington, D.C. I remember that Woodrow Wilson invited us, my colleague and I, Ms. Fatima Haqiqatjou, and I sat in such a panel discussion to propose and convince some skeptics, some friends in Washington, to even, we couldn't imagine we could initiate this deal and talk about that. It was really difficult. Finally, we tried to convince Huffington Post to publish the exact letter. It was 5 months almost before the election, presidential election. Even we didn't know that Mr. Rouhani and this great administration is coming, but we just heard something, some rumors that some intentions is going on between the behind the scenes between 2 administrations. The Obama administration and Iran's supreme leader's followers and his friends. Then we proposed this proposal and deal, and at that time we had lots of difficulties to even talk about that. But right now I sat here, and thank you for having me here again. We want to convince some very few skeptics in Washington, D.C. that we can help to finalize a comprehensive deal. It's very, very different moment than 2 years ago. So I'm very optimistic, and I hope that the United States especially won't lose this opportunity, because I think the U.S. lost the first opportunity in 2003 when they got the same agreement, but after saying, adding the name of Iran as axis of evil, I think it damaged the deal. I think this moment, inshallah, I hope that you won't lose this opportunity, and it would lead this deal, Iran and the region to a peace and stability in very near future.
Thank you. Howard, how do you see it? What are the prospects of getting this done at all, and what are the prospects of getting done by June 30?
I'm a little more nervous than you are about the likelihood of the agreement being reached, and it seems pretty clear to me that this American administration wants to reach an agreement. I think there are some limitations beyond which it won't go, but it certainly wants to reach the agreement. The question raised more recently is, does the Supreme Leader want to reach the agreement? He's made some statements in the recent days regarding the timing of sanctions relief, regarding the sanctity of security and military sites on which no inspectors can ever go. He's made other statements which look like he's thinking of a very, very different agreement than I think the P5 could ever sign. And then the question comes up, why is he talking like this? And the fact is, he has made statements like that before. He talked about 190,000 centrifuges at one point. He talked about a large number of reactors and enrichment facilities. And in the end, the one area of the administration's released parameters that they haven't really challenged is the reference to the numbers of centrifuges, the numbers of enrichment facilities. They don't seem to be arguing about those assertions in the administration parameters. So in the end, I think a lot of this depends. And we've heard for a long time, and I believe that there is a tension inside Iran between elements of the IRGC and the, quote, hardliners and the current president and foreign minister. And we've always thought, where does the Supreme Leader come down in that a conflict? And that, to me, will be a big part of answering the question of whether there's a likelihood of reaching an agreement by June 30th.
Ali Akbar, let me ask you if you want to comment. I think one of the questions we all have is, how should we read the Supreme Leader's statements? And do you have any advice for us on that one? And then I'm going to turn it over to Michael and Jim.
I would say that I don't agree with your comment about Iran's situation. I think I have lots of concern, mostly about the U.S. side, because in Iran we have a consensus between the Supreme Leader, the administration, the parliament, and vast majority of people. It's unprecedented in Iran about one very, very important issue. But how about here? No, I don't think so. In administration, yes, I agree with that. But how about the Congress? And how about the many influence and pressures to Congress, towards the Congress about, break the deal? I'm very, I have some doubt, but I'm not really concerned. As I said before, I'm optimistic even about Congress after April 14, that they got an agreement with the administration, the new legislation. But still, I think it's really great because it makes more this bill, in Congress, Mr. Cork's bill that passed in Senate, it makes more sustainable to implement in long term this agreement, but still we have lots of problems. I cannot predict what would be the decision of Congress after the final negotiation, final agreement, comprehensive agreement in end of June.
This is, just for those, this is a bill that was passed last week that gives the Congress 30 days to consider a nuclear deal, the option of legislation at the end of that time, and suspends any suspension of sanctions during the period of that consideration. So there is now some agreement now in the U.S. side of a process for consideration between the White House and the Congress. Though, let me ask Michael and Jim, there seems to be less agreement on what the substance of that agreement should be. Everybody seems to agree, well, a bad agreement is worse than no agreement, but there seems to be no real consensus of what a bad agreement would look like. And Secretary of State Baker, in an op-ed last Friday, suggested that one of the steps we ought to do is get our own house in order and identify the 3 or 4 things that really makes a reasonable agreement from the U.S. standpoint, and be clear about them, in the same way that some would say the Supreme Leader has been clear about what he needs. Is that a good course of action? Michael, let me start with you, and then Jim, go to you.
Sure. Well, you know, when you ask this question, is it a good deal or a bad deal, I think it really is sort of 2 questions, in a sense. The first is, does the deal do what we need it to do? Is it sort of valuable to our interests, to advance the objectives we've set out, in this case, having to do with nonproliferation and having to do with the threat that we perceive Iran poses in the Middle East? But there's a second question, too, and this is one that's highlighted by the President especially, which is, what are the alternatives? A good deal in comparison to what alternative course of action that would better advance our interests? And both of these questions are tremendously controversial. You know, Secretary of State Baker, in his op-ed, this is an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he basically said, he essentially said, what we've gotten, this is the right track, but it needs to be improved. And he said, here are sort of 3 or 4 ways in which he would suggest not just improving it, but he would suggest saying we have to insist on these things and get our other P5+1 partners to insist on them. That essentially gets to the first question, trying to make the deal more valuable to American interests, a better deal, as it were. And I do think that all of his suggestions are the right suggestions, in a sense. You know, getting Iran to sort of lay out for inspectors its past weaponization work and the sites and the individuals involved in that, getting to this question of military sites, which our military sites can quite easily be nuclear sites, as we've seen in the past, as well as this question of sanctions, phased relief of sanctions, and the so-called snapback of sanctions, which may be a bit of a myth in a sense, but that's a separate question. But I think it's important that we look, as we approach this next period, not just at the question of the substance of a deal, which he's addressing, but also the alternatives. We need to focus on improving our own alternatives, if in fact there's no deal, because it's highly possible, as Howard was saying, that we'll get no deal even if we want one. And so it's important that you look past that point of failure and say, where will we be, and making sure that we're well positioned if that happens, and also worsening Iran's alternatives, because there's more than one dimension to this. We're not the only party looking at this deal. And if Iran perceives its own alternatives as worse, then it might accept a deal which is more favorable to the United States. I think red lines can be useful, both in, first of all, you should know your own bottom lines in any negotiation. You should know what it is you're looking for. They can be useful perhaps as a negotiating tactic. And some would interpret the Supreme Leader's speech. One interpretation is that he's setting these maximalist red lines to influence the sort of dynamics of the negotiations, to get us to give more, as you would in any negotiation about just about anything. The thing about those red lines, though, is I think they have to be credible. You have to believe in them. So there's this internal process you have to go through, and I worry that, especially with American negotiators who tend to be, sort of more transparent in a sense, that if we don't actually believe that these bottom lines are good bottom lines to have, sort of privately, that trying to project them publicly will ultimately backfire on us, as it did in, say, the case of Syria. So we should have bottom lines. We need to figure out for ourselves internally what those bottom lines are, and then we need to figure out how do you best project those tactically as part of a negotiation. I will just say, additionally, this all sort of presumes that the deal can be fixed. That's Secretary of State Baker's thesis, essentially, that the deal isn't where it needs to be, but it's the right track, and we need to fix it, essentially. I worry that the deal can't be fixed, that the design of the deal is conceptually flawed in several different ways. One way is, for example, even if we get this deal, it will require probably any president, not just President Obama, but his successor, and maybe even that person's successor, to be waiving sanctions every 6 months. It's a very unstable process because anything can intervene in that process. Some of the hardest decisions are left until the future. Negotiators love to do that because it saves the hard stuff for when they're not around anymore, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to come to pass when those dates come. Second, we have not required Iran to dismantle anything. Essentially, its entire nuclear program remains intact. And I think that even if you have positive change in Iran, even if Iran sort of changes its regional strategy, becomes friendlier to the United States, whatever sort of best case outcome you can imagine, having that nuclear program intact there will ultimately be a net negative for the security of the region. Nuclear programs tend to grow in groups or in pairs, as many here know. And I think that even a sort of different sort of Iran with that very robust nuclear program will be perceived as a threat by, for example, regional neighbors. And frankly, any future Iranian government may have a very hard time giving any of that up for reasons of national pride, absence the pressure of sanctions. And then just finally, the other conceptual flaw is that we have separated between the nuclear issues and the regional issues. The problem is there are instruments of power, sanctions, for example. They're blunt instruments. There's no such thing as a nuclear-related sanction. And so it gets to the question of how will we deter Iranian support for terrorism or Iran's activities in the region following a deal without these tools being available. And it either leads you to less effective tools or more, say, direct action, which actually leads you into sort of more direct involvement in, say, the conflicts of the region. So I worry that, yes, Secretary Baker's ideas are good red lines to have. They're good bottom line positions to have. But that ultimately the deal as conceived can't be successful even if we reach it.
Jim, what is your view from the U.S. standpoint? What do we do to get our own house in order in terms of proceeding with these negotiations?
One of the things I want to share is that in December, when I was in Tehran, I had an opportunity to visit with members of the Majlis, key people in the Rouhani government, leading clerics. They're friends of the Supreme Leader. And every place I went, especially to the Majlis, I heard one question, and that was, can President Obama implement the deal? They really wanted to know this, and this was, of course, after our elections, after the fact that the Senate had been taken over by Republicans, and, of course, the House continued to be in Republican hands. So they were raising this question because they wanted me to understand that if we expected them to put their best offer on the table, they wanted to know that that best deal could be accepted and would not be scuttled by our Congress. And I think we need to be mindful that as all of these questions arise from the Congress, it undermines our negotiators' capacity to get the best deal at the negotiating table. And that's a part of this that hasn't been adequately focused on. And the Iranians are very fearful, those that are really aggressively committing to a deal. And in many cases, I believe they have bet their political futures and their political careers on getting a deal with the United States. Their worst nightmare is that they go out on the limb, so to speak, put the best deal on the table that they can possibly get and have the United States Congress scuttle the deal. That politically destroys them, and it may do even more than that to them. And I don't think that we have, as Americans, fully understood that dimension of what's going on in the negotiations. I'm a Kansas Democrat, so Kansas is the most Republican state in the Union probably, so optimism is sort of hardwired into my DNA. But, I think that we have this historic moment, and the great tragedy would be that our domestic political forces prevented us from really getting a historic breakthrough in this relationship with Iran. So all Americans really need to be in this debate, and we really need to be focused on some of these very tough details. And as far as I'm concerned, verification is going to be the key in all of the dimensions of verification. So, for example, I'm troubled by the statements that the Supreme Leader has made about denying access to certain military sites. I can understand sort of the military need for that from the Iranian side, but we are going to have access, unquestioned access, to all of the sites that have anything to do with the nuclear operation. And that is a red line. And I think that that's going to be tough to get to.
I want to follow up on that and frame this question and then go really down the line. Howard, starting with you and going right down the line. In light of this conversation, there's two ways to frame it. What are the principal obstacles that could prevent the parties from getting an agreement? Or flipping it around, what are the 2 or 3 things that are really required if an agreement is going to be reached? And Howard, let me start with you if I could.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that has changed. I can certainly understand why one could look at Washington and think the administration's trying to do one thing, the Congress is instinctively and adamantly against what it's trying to do. How do we count on an agreement with the administration? The equation changed tremendously in the context of this agreement that was worked out between Senator Corker and Senator Cardin and the White House, because it turned everything around. One, the Congress will not act on the agreement before there's an agreement. Secondly, while the Congress will, there's no way in the world the Congress will ever approve this agreement, the only way the agreement doesn't go into effect, and by that I mean the president loses his ability to waive the sanctions that he will need to waive to do the American part of the deal, is if 2/3 of both houses disapprove of the agreement and then vote to override the president's veto. So to me, the debate has changed from instinctively not wanting to do any deal with Iran, particularly a deal that didn't dismantle their entire nuclear infrastructure, and Michael's right about that, this deal doesn't do that. It changed from that debate to a debate about issues like, is this a good deal? And more than that, is it a good deal on the issue of giving significant comfort for a significant period of time that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon? Because Michael raised other issues, which are very legitimate issues to raise. But I don't think Iran's support for terrorism, Iran's hegemonic tendency, the sanctions effort that brought the international community together was about Iran's nuclear program. And if we try to conflate and bring in every issue into this, we will lose the support of the international community. So I actually think we now are at the test of, is this a bad agreement in the context that Michael asked? Is this the least worst option? There's no, and that will be the question that 34 senators, if they think it is the least worst option, the deal goes into effect. Divide 1/3 into 435 congressmen in the same equation. That's very much changed the balance of power here now. And so I think the parts that I don't know about this agreement, the level of verification, what is true, just exactly what is going to be the centrifuges that are pulled out of Natanz? What are the consequences when Iran says no to a particular desire by the inspectors to go to a certain site? Those things that hopefully will get filled out as part of, in the next 2.5 months, those will decide how the Congress reacts. So I think it's a much less bleak situation than it was last December in terms of talking with the folks you talked to in Tehran.
Yeah, I agree with you, Howard, that the congressional action last week has fundamentally changed the equation here. And I think that if Iranians look at this, I mean, the bottom line is, will the White House be able to hold 1/3 plus 1 in the House? And
Probably
can they-
not for a bad agreement.
Probably not for a bad agreement. You're absolutely correct. And I think the bad agreement ultimately will be defined by the issues of verification. In other words, nobody trusts anybody in this deal. And all this stuff about, well, you can't trust the Iranians. Well, the Iranians don't trust us. We don't trust them. That is a given. Let's quit talking about that. You know, the fact of the matter is we have to have adequate verification procedures. And that's what I think the Congress is going to ultimately be looking at. And when you look at the context of this agreement, and perhaps Michael and I would disagree on this, I think given the status quo compared to this outline as described by the State Department, okay? And I underline that because there is clearly a disparity between what the State Department has outlined and what Zarif has outlined, okay? But given the State Department outline, compared to the status quo, and given the fact when you start going through this that the number of centrifuges being dropped from 19,000 to 5,060 operational, the volume of low-enriched uranium being dropped from 10,000 kilos to 3,000 kilos, or 300 kilos. And you know, the other provisions in this, and the basically fundamentally changing Iraq and the plutonium operation, and fundamentally changing what's going on at Fordow. I mean, these are significant concessions made by the other side, and given the status quo, I think is a major step forward. Again, it all depends on verification.
So, Michael, let me go to you, put you on the spot a bit. Is this deal, as outlined in the State Department fact sheet, the least bad outcome? And if it isn't, what is required to make it, in your view, the least bad outcome? And then I'm going to ask you to comment briefly on what you've heard.
So my answer to the first one is no, I don't think it is the least bad outcome. I do worry that the deal as outlined in the U.S. fact sheet, first of all, it's not a deal. There's clearly unresolved issues, and so it's hard to really evaluate per se because of those unresolved issues. But I do think that there are some big holes in what we have agreed to. And I think some of those are what Secretary Baker outlined. I think it's absolutely critical, for example, that those questions that we call PMD, possible military dimensions, what Iran has done, that those really be answered up front. Because I don't see how you can have a sufficient verification regime without those questions having been answered. Because it's not a matter of, I mean, people say, well, why do you need Iran to confess? It's not about a confession, it's about the information, I think, and the inspectors need that. What are the sites they need to check? Who are the people they need to talk to? What progress has Iran made to date? I don't think you can verify without those things. I do think there are other issues, the questions of how are sanctions relieved and when. I think it's important that we maintain leverage going forward in the event of Iranian noncompliance, because I think there will inevitably be questions about compliance. There always are with these types of regimes. There's also this question about access to sites, and we've talked about that already. I don't think we can permit a distinction between civilian nuclear sites and military sites, given the clear sort of military nature of Iran's past nuclear activities. So within the context of what's been outlined, I think that those things need to be addressed to make this a deal worth supporting, worth making, really. But then there's, again, I constantly get back to the question of alternatives. And I think that one thing we neglect here in our debate is that, again, it's not just about what are the United States alternatives, it's what are Iran's alternatives. And I think that this raises the question of time, because we could really afford to negotiate for another 6 months if we had to. It's great to set deadlines in diplomacy if you're really committed to those deadlines and they're credible. I don't know, frankly, that deadlines we set at this stage are credible. But we could afford to negotiate for another 6 months or 12 months, frankly. I think the Iranians really can afford far less to simply see this, say, the interim agreement extended another 6 or 12 months. And I think that we need to bear in mind that Iran's own alternatives are not fantastic. And so we need to, I think, be, for the sake of having a sustainable deal, a deal that actually survives past 21 months or 24 months, I think it's important that we get what we need here. Will it then be sort of a great deal? I'll still say that it wouldn't be a great deal because of these conceptual flaws. And I would worry a lot that the deal would not survive the 10 years even of the initial period. But it's probably at this stage of the game the best that we could hope for.
Thank you. I want to come back to that issue of what happens if by June 30 we don't have an agreement. But Ali Akbar, let me ask you this. Given your hopes for this agreement, as you expressed in your opening comments, and given what you've heard here, does it reassure you about some of the questions you had about the U.S. side?
Reassured me at first. Let me say at this point that we have much more problem in U.S. side. Please accept this idea than in Iran. Sometimes I'm joking with some Iranian friends that, especially when you had problems that Congress had shut down the government, I was joking to some Americans that saying that you don't have supreme leader here. If you had supreme leader, could order. No, it's a bad idea. Don't do that. But I'm just joking. But so now I'm just comparing the current two systems, political system in Iran and in the United States, especially the current parliament. You don't have too much problem. They are already in agreement, and the Supreme Leader, if the Supreme Leader decides something, especially this current government, the Parliament would approve it definitely, and right now they approved. The Supreme Leader has created a new term, which was, very, very new for us, at least in here, I think. Also for you, the term is so-called heroic flexibility. So that's it, finished, and all in the same page. But in here, we don't have such a system, more democratic system we have here, we've seen here. And between administration and the Congress, we have lots of difficulties. So let me ask you, please accept from the panel, accept this idea that about the comprehensive deal. We have much more problem in here than Iran. But secondly, I don't agree. Let me express my idea about your idea that we can extend 6 months or 12 months again to negotiate and negotiate and negotiate. Because two important elections is coming and is going to be escalated. In here, the next presidential election, and in Iran, two important elections at the same day and the same time, in February 2016, election for parliament and expert assembly, which is very, very important this moment, the second one also. So I think if you extend the negotiations 6 months or 12 months especially, the domestic policy would affect much more the negotiations, and you cannot get out of these negotiations when you extend for too long. Maybe you can imagine, for example, 10 days or 20 days, 1 month, like you in the last bill, they got in agreement between the administration and Congress. It's fine, but more than that, I can imagine that it would certainly put this agreement, the comprehensive deal, in jeopardy. So this is the second point. And my last point about what you mentioned previously is that I don't think the verification would be a major problem, because we had the same issue in the past when President Rouhani was the secretary of the National Security Council, and President Khatami was was in power. I was in parliament. I remember you had this situation and problem, and Iran voluntarily gave you to access, the IAEA, to access many places, including some military places like Parchin. And but it has it has its own process, technical problem, which is not my expertise in IAEA. When they want to ask to have access to certain military places, but when they accept to execute additional protocol, I think it would assure you and everybody, if they have any problem, security problem, for example, Israel security, if they have concern about that, it would assure you, it should assure you and everybody to saying that it won't have, problem about that. But about the second problem, that right now both sides are talking with each other, in Iran especially, is about sanction. It's much more tougher than the first one, I think. Because the first one about executing or implementation of additional protocol voluntarily is already accepted in Geneva. I believe that I heard. But about sanctions, I think we have two different ideas, and they are opposing each other. And I think it's also practical and resolvable, and you can resolve it as well during this 2 months or so.
What I hear is I think it's going to come down to these two issues, this verification and monitoring issue, which has a number of aspects we talked about, and the relaxation of sanctions. Those seem to be the two crunch issues. We have heard now, Michael suggests that we have more time. We've heard Ali Akbar suggest that not much more time because it gets politically complicated. So let me bring you, Jim, in and Howard in and say, if at June 30 we have not bridged the apparent differences on these two issues, two critical issues, what do we do? And what's plan B, or what is the plan for a soft landing so that this does not badly damage the situation in the region?
Well, first of all, I feel very strongly that we shouldn't be budging on this June 30th deadline.
Interesting.
I think that we have to dig in on this. Both sides have to recognize that the clock is running out for both of us, and for different reasons. But let me just observe that if this gets kicked down the road for months, we're into heavy political campaign season. We'll soon be into the Iowa caucuses. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that the political pressure domestically is going to be so intense, especially on the Republican side. And let me explain why. In the Republican primary, the Christian fundamentalist vote is vitally important to all of these candidates on the Republican side. They're appealing to the Christian fundamentalist. And on the East Coast, I don't think we have, there's just not the awareness of the rising influence of Christian Zionism in this country. So we have this reality emerging in the heartland where the strongest supporters of Israel are Christian Zionists, who are now in the Christian fundamentalist camp, basically. And these are voters that are vitally important to these Republicans running for president. And so what this is going to do, coupled with the fact that we have literally hundreds of millions of dollars moving in the American political process based on this issue. It's a staggering amount of money. And all of this is going to put enormous pressure, especially on the Republican candidates for president. Why am I saying this? It is going to solidify Republican opposition to any deal. And it's going to make this whole process much more political than it otherwise would be. And so this deadline of June the 30th has to be hard for both sides. If I was in Iran, and if I was looking at this from the Iranian perspective, I would say, my goodness, we've got to get a deal, and we've got to get it now. And we better be flexible in how we get there, because the clock is not on our side of the table. And I think that the Iranians that I've had an opportunity to visit with, they understand the historic moment. For the first time in maybe 35 years, we have high-ranking leadership in Tehran and high-ranking leadership in the United States that are together wanting a deal. And I think this makes this a historic moment. And I think we better be smart enough to take advantage of it.
Howard, how do you see it if we get to June 30 and don't have it done?
Well, I share Jim's nervousness, perhaps for some different reasons. The whole thread of this is the pressure that came from international sanctions on the Iranian economy.
And the election of Rouhani. We tend to blow by that.
But everything is wrapped together.
Related.
Yes, it's related.
Yes.
Agreed.
For the first, the administration has been U.S. government has been sanctioning Iran since 1979. With the exception for a brief period of time of some pistachios and carpets, an American company could not do business with Iran. In the late 90s, we decided to go extraterritorial and impose sanctions on investment in Iran's energy sector of more than $20 million. Neither the Clinton administration nor the Bush administration ever imposed a sanction on there because of the international pushback that they feared would come from extraterritorial sanctions on foreign companies that made those investments. Whatever you think of the President of the United States, he undertook a strategy that developed an international coalition. I don't think the Ahmadinejad presidency with the supreme leader was going to extend its hand in the first year of the Obama administration and unclench their fist. But I thought it was necessary for the administration and the president to be willing to do that, to build up the international coalition that would come down. I remember oil for food, and I watched on Iraq a consensus on sanctions that started to wither and wither away. And I fear the same thing happens here. All I'm saying is, I think we should get a good deal done by June 30th. The extension of the JPOA it's interesting because there were people who thought that was a terrible mistake. And it provides limited sanctions relief. It's not going to take the pressure off the Iranian economy. It's not going to make the people of Iran, and again, it's more time for the unity of the P5 to sever. And this is a very different time than 2009 and 2010 when this coalition was put together. Russia is taking a very different approach, generally on issues. There are all kinds of potential chinks here that I'm concerned about. So I'd like to see it done now.
Let me ask one more question, and then we're going to go to the audience for questions, and that is this. If we've talked a little bit about what happens if we don't get a deal. If we do get a deal, Ali Akbar, I'd like to start with you on this if I could. What are the likelihood that a nuclear agreement would lead to some kind of breakthrough in relations between Iran and the United States, between Iran and its Sunni neighbors, and what impact might it have on Iranian behavior on other issues of concern like Syria and Yemen and the like? And I'd like to hear from you, and then just go quickly down the line, and then we'll go to the audience for questions.
First of all, I would like to emphasize on that point that President Obama mentioned, and they finally got an agreement with Congress that it's a big fault to tying any other issues other than nuclear in this negotiation, or bring inside this comprehensive deal that it makes almost impossible, the deal. But other than that, if you take a look at the last speech of the Supreme Leader in Iran, before yesterday, I mean the last one, I think almost 10 days ago, he mentioned something that I think it was for the first time, that mentioned that if we got in agreement with the United States and the Western countries and we could implement it, and I mean, we got this deal, we may allow the negotiators to negotiate about other problems that we have maybe with the international community, I mean, especially in the United States. So it was for the first time that he mentioned. So right after that, I would imagine that this deal, it would lead the negotiators to talk about, especially at first, regional issues like ISIS, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many regional problems that we have right now, and work on that and getting agreements like the agreement that we are close to get about the nuclear issue. And lastly, I think it may lead to even broad this conversation and negotiations to normalize the relationship between the United States and Iran, and after that maybe even it may lead to negotiate about some internal problem that we have about human rights and many other issues. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. Is going to happen very soon if we got this agreement and put it away from the face, between the international community and Iran.
Bottom line, based on 10 years of interaction with Iranians, from the business community, from the religious communities, from the political communities in Iran, I am totally convinced that Iran wants a reset with the United States, with some limitations. And I think that, this nuclear agreement, from the standpoint of just U.S. national security interest, is extremely important to get this nuclear issue solved. And it's extremely important, obviously, for Israel as well. If we can do this and make progress there, it is a platform from which we can move to a lot of other discussions. And we can do so focusing on those areas where there is common interest. There are issues in the region that the United States and Iran share and need to address. ISIS. ISIS hates Iranians as much as it does Jews and Christians and Americans. We can work together, Iran and the United States, dealing with ISIS. I also believe there's an opportunity to deal with the issue of Hezbollah in Lebanon. All of this stuff can be on the table. And the first step is to get this terrible nuclear question resolved and use the confidence, maybe a little bit of trust that we can build in dealing with this to build a better future together.
Michael, prospects for a broader opening?
I think that at this stage they're dim, even if we get a nuclear agreement. It's important to keep in mind, on the one hand, that we have already talked to the Iranians many times over the years about regional issues. We've talked to them about Iraq, we've talked to them about Afghanistan, and well before we had serious nuclear negotiations, we were doing these things. And I think that we should maintain, I think one thing that's critical for us to maintain is flexibility on our tactics. I think that when we're conducting foreign policy, we can't be dogmatic when it comes to tactics. And so I think that we shouldn't regard it as terrible to use the tactic of engagement, for example. At the same time, I think we need to be quite unrelenting when it comes to our objectives and defending our interests. And here, I think, is where the difficulty between the U.S. and Iran lies. I think there is far more divergence between American and Iranian interests and strategies, importantly, too, because we may share, for example, a view that ISIS is bad for the region, but the way that Iran goes about dealing with that problem is itself inimical to American interests. And we've seen this playing out in places like Tikrit and so forth. It's, I think, important to bear that in mind. So I don't think that we are at this stage ripe for that kind of breakthrough, because I don't think we have seen the broader shift by Iran that we have been looking for so long. I mean, this agreement that if we get it, will be very narrow and technical. It's not going to deliver the kind of rapprochement or shift that we have so long talked about. I just want to say that, so whether Iran actually wants that, I think is very much in question. The Supreme Leader hasn't really moderated his language about the United States. We're still accused daily of having created ISIS. Just yesterday, an Iranian general said that ISIS were American protégés and so forth. So we're far away from that. On the American side, though, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this sort of undertone that democracy is somehow a diplomatic liability. It's certainly not. It's one of our tremendous sources of strength diplomatically in the world and of soft power. And it's true that, as an American leader, you can't simply, decide your own policy and forge ahead. You have to have your people behind you. You have to have constituencies behind you. And so one danger here, of course, is that, the president needs to make sure he has people behind him, that he has public opinion behind him. And one thing you see is that I think Americans would like to see a negotiated agreement. Polls are very clear about that. But they're also very uncomfortable with this broader set of issues. They're very suspicious about whether, in fact, the agreement will be successful in delivering. And so there's also, in a democracy, you have to deliver a deal which has buy-in of your own people. You have to deliver a deal which is therefore sustainable over the course of election cycles. And I think we can't see that as a bad thing. We have to see that as a source of strength for our country.
Howard?
I wonder if, at least in assuming there is a deal and that it is, from our American perspective, a good deal and does not get disapproved by the Congress, goes into effect, I think there's a potential for a great going in the other direction, because it's not just evangelical Zionists. I mean, there's a larger concern about a bad deal, but there's concern in the Gulf, there's concern in Israel, and my own sense, a little bit of the message I heard when the president announced what he was going to, the framework agreement, and it was a very strange announcement. He announced one thing, and the EU and the P5+1 and the Iranians announced another thing, but he made a point of emphasizing the efforts, both with Israel and with our traditional Arab allies, to demonstrate that we are going to be there for them in many ways. And yesterday morning's New York Times had an article about the level of weaponry we are in the process of sending to our traditional allies, the Saudis, the UAE, and our once in a while, sometimes traditional ally Qatar. Maybe not traditional, there's nothing traditional there. But mutual defense agreements, things to deal with the belief that Iran has hegemonic interests, and Americans' willingness to stand with these allies in the region against those interests. To what extent does that, I guess what I'm saying is I think there'll be an embassy in Havana before there's one in Tehran.
Let me go to the audience if we can, and you'll have a chance to jump in. All right, two final comments from you and from Jim, and then we'll go to the audience. I was overruled by my panel.
No.
Mr. Singh said that we already had negotiations with Iran about many other issues other than nuclear. My question is that which negotiation? Can you please tell me that, and what was the outcome? I think you just invited Iran and worked just behind the scenes, not officially, when I was in Parliament, to talk about the Afghanistan issue that you had. Iran completely cooperated with the United States, but right after that, President Bush mentioned and had this very famous statement saying that Iran is one of the, I think, three countries, axis of evil. So it damaged. When, other than this time, when did you have serious negotiation? When did you, I mean the US, recognize Iran as a partner, as a stakeholder? Iran is a regional power. There is no doubt. I think you agree with me.
One thing
you didn't invite. Even about Syria, one time United Nations had in Geneva meeting, and Ban Ki-moon invited Iran. Right after that, because of the pressure of the United States, they canceled the invitation. So, but behind the scenes, you had other cooperation recently about ISIS. Iran already cooperated about Tikrit, but you didn't have coordination or officially saying that Iran is at least one stakeholder in the region, and invite them and respect them, talk to them. Like now, you are talking with Iran, I think it's almost 2 years. about just nuclear. You didn't have this opportunity. We didn't have this opportunity to invite Iran and recognize Iran as a partner, not as an enemy. I think you should answer this question.
Quick copy, and I will answer that. Quick copy.
Yeah,
Comment from you.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to something Howard mentioned, which I think is very important, and that is that I know that our Sunni allies in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and Jordan, are very fearful of a rapprochement between the United States and Iran, and they see it as sort of them losing influence, Iran gaining influence. I think Israel has some similar concerns. And you're absolutely spot on in the need for us to make sure that our Sunni allies and Israel understand that just because we have an improved relationship between the United States and Iran does not in any way diminish our obligations to the defense of Israel and to our historic commitments to our Sunni friends and allies in the region. And I think that there's going to need to be tremendous diplomatic effort made to reaffirm those historic obligations and commitments.
We'll go to questions. I need to say one thing. One of the things that seems to be lost in history is that there was an agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue in 2003 and 2004 between the EU3, Britain, the UK, France, and Germany, and Iran. And it involved the suspension of enrichment and a negotiation to eliminate that program. That agreement broke down in the implementation heavily because of the election of Ahmadinejad as president of Iran in 2005, the spring of 2005, on a very different agenda. And he walked away from that agreement and restarted the nuclear program. I raise that because the implementation and execution of these kinds of agreements is very difficult and is going to require a lot of commitment in both sides, which is why it is so important that if there is an agreement, it has bipartisan support in the Congress of the United States and bipartisan support of the American people so that there can be the sustained implementation of that agreement. Because we've seen on the North Korean agreement in 1994 and in the 2003-2004 agreement with Iran and the EU3 that you can lose these agreements if you cannot have a sustained and successful implementation. Questions from the audience? Let's start right here. Mike, coming to you. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Farzan Sabet. I'm a visiting fellow at Georgetown and managing editor of IranPolitik.com. So my question is for Mr. Singh. I'm wondering if you could expand on something you said earlier that's been on my mind, but I haven't heard really addressed anywhere else, which is, does a final nuclear deal take sanctions off the table as a major foreign policy tool on Iran? The assumption being that sanctions have been so tied to the nuclear issue that if the U.S. tries to do a major sanctions push on another issue, then Iran can re-escalate on the nuclear issue because sanctions are the whole reason it constrained its nuclear program in the first place. Thank you.
So I think that it's a very complicated issue. And when we talk in these agreements, and it's in the text of agreement, about a nuclear-related sanction, it's important to bear in mind there is no such thing as a nuclear-related sanction in American law. And so the first question is, what sanctions exactly do we have in mind, and does it in any way match with what the Iranians have in mind? My guess is the answer to that right now is no, and that will be one of the things which the negotiators are talking about. If you look, for example, at sanctions on the National Iranian Oil Company, NIOC, these sanctions are for NIOC's association with the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is not nuclear-related per se. If you look at the sanctions on Iran's arms exports, these are contained in UN Security Council Resolution 1929. That is a tool which has nothing, in a sense, to do with the nuclear program, but is nuclear-related in its implementation. Then you look at sanctions on Iran's nuclear imports and exports, clearly nuclear-related, but we'll want to keep those in place for obvious reasons, and the agreement gets into this question of procurement. So the sanctions question is actually very complicated, far more complicated, I think, than often it's given credit for. I think, though, that what's clear is that what Iran is looking for out of this agreement is to get substantial relief from sanctions, especially those which prohibit its access to the international financial system and the sanctions on its oil exports. Now, to the extent you think those are the only sanctions, as Congressman Berman said, that have really gotten Iran to budge, you could have a debate about that itself. It's obvious, therefore, why they'd want those lifted. If we lift them, we're lifting them, right? We're not saying we're going to lift them on the nuclear issue and then reimpose them for some other reason. That doesn't seem sustainable, right? And so the question is, what tools that are effective are you then left with to influence Iran's behavior? So when we say we're going to maintain sanctions on these other things, the question should be, how will that be effective in this environment of slackening pressure on the most important points, giving Iran tremendous amounts of revenue? I think the Wall Street Journal suggested $50 billion. Getting to Congressman Berman's point about, not only will Iran not only do we not negotiate on these regional issues, but in fact Iran will have much more revenue if they wish to pursue these regional activities that we're so concerned about. So my concern is that because you need to demonstrate your commitment to countering Iran on those points, and your major sanctions tools are no longer available to you, that it actually leads you to more direct action. It leads you to more involvement in the region against Iranian activities than you had to begin with. Unless you deliver this sort of, I think very unlikely at this stage, rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran somehow changes its behavior. And there is a sense that people have that I think discomfits them, that this agreement is built on a gamble that will happen.
Yes, sir, right here.
Hi, Daniel Lakin, research consultant at the Tavana Initiative. My question is for any panelist who feels like they should answer. Assuming that a deal is reached, and assuming that the various timelines that were outlined in the press releases, 10 years on limits of centrifuges and so on, are adhered to my mind, it seems that there have been critics of the deal that says after 10 years, that part is null and void, and Iran can do whatever it likes. To my mind, the challenge then becomes what can the U.S. and Iran do in that time to change the calculus, or specifically what can the U.S. do to change Iran's calculus so that that is no longer such an alarming prospect once the 10 years go by. I'm wondering, do any of you agree with that way of looking at things, and what can the U.S. do towards that end? Thank you.
Anyone want to? I'll just answer briefly. The agreement does provide that a number of provisions dealing with supply chain and inspections go beyond 10 years. And in any event, even after the agreement expires, Iran will be subject to the kinds of inspection provisions that come with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the IAEA Safeguards Agreement and the additional protocol and the like. So there will be some things that are designed under the NPT rubric to ensure that a country that is signed up to the NPT to be a non-nuclear state is not moving towards a nuclear weapon. The question that is raised is, if you leave Iran with a substantial nuclear infrastructure, how confident can you be that those will be adequate? And I guess the other thing I would say is that those can be reinforced by a declaration that the president has made many times, and several presidents have said, which is, if Iran moves towards a nuclear weapon, that is a line that raises the military issue. So it isn't that everything is over. The question will be, is the post-agreement inspection regime and verification regime adequate to ensure that with this nuclear infrastructure, Iran is not able to covertly move towards a nuclear weapon?
And the additional protocol continues for 15 years, doesn't it? And then at least 15 years.
No, additional protocol is forever.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it's forever.
The problem is, in our version, right?
Yeah.
There is a distinction. There's something beyond the additional protocol. The additional protocol is not quite anytime, anywhere, at the moment, we get to see something that concerns us.
And that will be one of the issues on this verification issue. Are there additional measures applicable to Iran that would be in addition to the additional protocol that would last in perpetuity for a longer period of time? And how will Iran respond to that? Because the supreme leader has said that that is off the table. Iran is not going to be treated differently than other non-nuclear weapon states. Yes, ma'am, back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Pat Bergstresser, and I'm the former Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs Advisor at the State Department for Iraq, but I've spent time in Iran. And the question that I keep hearing people ask is what is actually driving U.S. foreign policy today. We've partnered with people like Saddam Hussein, we've partnered with bin Laden, and the question that I hear is it the lobbyists? Is it the political consultants? Is it political careers? And are we going to have a balance in terms of treating all countries basically with the same rules? That would be the best way to say it.
Anyone want to take that one on?
If I could, when I look at the Middle East right now over the next few years, I think ISIS is going to be a very, very serious threat to many countries in the region. And I find it very interesting and important that Iran and the United States have a common interest in confronting and dealing with ISIS. And, you know, just think about World War II, for goodness sakes. You know, if we had failed to realize that we needed to deal with Joe Stalin, would we have been able to win the war? Short answer to that question is probably not. And so there are times when the facts on the ground demand that you deal with people that you may not necessarily like to deal with, because there is a greater evil that must be confronted. And so I see an opportunity here for the United States and Iran to cooperate in dealing with a horrible threat to the region right now in the form of ISIS. I am mindful that if that is not done properly, that our Sunni friends in the region will be very fearful, and they'll see Iranian influence growing. But let me just make a quick observation on this. Iran is a country of 80 million people. It is 3 times the size of Iraq. It is 3 times the size of Saudi Arabia. It has the world's 4th largest supply of oil, the world's 2nd largest supply of natural gas. It is a regional superpower when it comes to energy. And the people, at 90% literacy rate of everybody under 45. The median age in Iran is 28. People don't realize this, but 60% of the university students are female, 65% of the graduate students are female. And the biggest problem I think Iran's going to have in the future is, what in the world are we going to do with all these educated women?
And Ed?
You know, and I just think that we have to recognize that whether we like it or not, a country of that size, with that level of education and sophistication, with their history, they are going to be a powerful influence in the region, whether we like it or not. It's a little bit like pretending like China isn't going to have growing influence in Asia. You know, they're going to have growing influence. And we have to deal with the new realities in these areas.
I guess from my point of view, I think that, look, American foreign policy needs to be guided by a sense of our national interests and a sense of our objectives. And I think actually if you look at American foreign policy in the Middle East over the years, we have not had actually that different a sense from one administration to the next of what are our interests in the region, what should our objectives be in the region, though we have had very significant disagreements over the strategies that we should pursue and the tactics that we should employ in support of those strategies. And I think that's absolutely appropriate. This is the foreign policy debate in Washington. But, you know, if you look at, for example, President Obama's Iran policy, compare it to President Bush's Iran policy, which I helped work on when I was in the National Security Council, the distinctions are not stark. They are distinctions that are significant, to be sure, but not massive. So we have the same basic objective: prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, preserve the global nonproliferation regime, preserve stability in the Middle East to the extent we can. And to do that, to use sanctions and diplomacy. President Bush's charge to us was to find a way between Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon and going to war with Iran. And I would say that's probably still what motivates American policymakers. And so we have these great debates in Washington, and it's, you know, we should, and it's, you know, what I think a lot of us enjoy doing in a sense. But it's important not to exaggerate the fundamental differences in the foreign policy of the United States from one to the next. And in terms of the regimes and should they be applied equally and so forth, well, look, the fact is you can't take a cookie-cutter approach to different countries. Japan has a significant nuclear weapons program and is, by all accounts,
Not a
complying.
nuclear weapons program.
I'm sorry.
Civil.
I misspoke. Japan has a significant nuclear program, which is civilian, and has abided by its obligations. Iran violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty not just in 2002, with the Arak and Natanz facilities, but with then that subsequent Fordo facility by refusing to answer IAEA inspectors' questions. And so here what you see is that Iran is in the situation it's in because it has violated the commitments which it voluntarily signed up to. And so I think it's entirely appropriate that it get treated differently than some other country.
Well, just one last thing on. There's no doubt that special interests, lobbies, groups of people have influence on American foreign policy. That is called democracy. But in the end, I think it is that role in decisions made, I think, is quite overblown. My guess is the Cold War and people's perceptions of the Cold War had a lot more to do with what we did in Iran in 1954 than a particular oil company. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not, but there is some sense of people trying to find the national interest. Pressure groups influence, yes, but I don't think they're as decisive as people want to think.
We're running to the end of our time, and what I'd like to do is take about 3 questions and then give panelists a chance to respond to those questions, and we'll see how much time we have left. Let's take the trifecta of 3 people right up there. Ma'am, you in the back, and then the 2 gentlemen right in front. This triangle right here.
Hi, my name is Haim Nawaz. I have no affiliation. My question is for Mr. Michael Singh. The Obama administration will be hosting the Gulf states in Camp David next month. Do you see this an opportunity to bridge the gap between the administration's position on the deal, since we fundamentally see it differently than our Gulf partners? We see it as a way to curtail and limit the threat of Iran, and they see it as a way to increase the threat of Iran. Second, on the sanctions, they argue that a deal would not adjust Iran's attitude in the region, and they don't want the sanctions to be lifted because of that. Well, we have the sanctions now, and Iran did not adjust its attitude anyway. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Frank Fletcher, a researcher with Daniel Morgan Academy here in D.C. Mr. Hadley, what do you think the Iranian missile capability says about Iranian intentions?
Yes, sir.
My name is Hussein Karaguli, no affiliation. A question to Dr. Mousavi. You mentioned the Supreme Leader. His health, we understand, is deteriorating, and there doesn't seem to be any clarity as to who would come after him. So I would flip the question that you had brought about the consensus internally in Iran, and if the Supreme Leader were not to be with us anymore, how would that change the verification and the credibility of the deal that Iran would be signing? And very quickly, also to Congressman Berman, I'm wondering if a deal with Iran would actually help with our Arab allies and those within our Arab allies that are still ISIS fanboys, and whether a deal with Iran would actually help the stability in the region. Your thoughts on that?
Fine. Let me ask if someone has a question for Jim Slattery, in which case, if we do, we'll take that one, and then everyone will have an opportunity to answer a question and make any final comments. Any questions for Mr. Slattery? This is a chance. Yes, ma'am. Down here in the second row.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I was just wondering, when you raised the issue of the political, the Christian Zionist movement as a factor in shaping the prospective success of this deal or not, do you think that if it's settled by June 30th, that there might not be more efforts to derail it even after the deal goes through?
Yeah.
Good.
If I
Let me take all of these, and we're just going to go right down the line, if we can. Start with you. Ali Akbar, please.
In general, I would say that both sides of in the United States and Iran, we are suffering from lack of understanding each other. The culture of Iran, many proverbs and many cultural words that we have in our culture, I don't think 80% of that we understand in the United States, and vice versa. Here, many things in politics and is going on inside the United States, and in Iran, we don't have enough knowledge. So I think either also about the Supreme Leader's speech and other people. And I think I just heard, I'm hearing always Mr. Alan Ayer is working on Iran's culture and talking with Iranians and can communicate, because I think daily he has access to some literature or talking to Iranians. So we need this kind of exchange right now. We should not wait until finalize even this deal. You asked me that U.S. what can U.S. do to help to bridge this gap. I think you should start right now expanding this sort of exchange, educational, tourism, many things. You are not allowing Iran UN ambassador exceptionally to come here and talk directly to you, to the politicians. You should allow them right away to come here and daily talk to you, and you have lots of restrictions to travel to Iran. You can cancel, Obama can cancel direct flights to Iran from tomorrow, Mr. Singh, and you can go to Iran and talk directly with Iranians. Vice versa, I talked to some members of parliaments when they come here, like now, besides the World Bank meetings last year. He was just criticizing the U.S. I mentioned, U.S. is here. You are in the United States. You should go to talk to the Congress. And finally, fortunately, he had some kind of tour, and besides that, had some discussion. And right after that, I heard lots of words and sentences from him about new understanding about what's going on in the politics in the United States. We need both. Mr. Slattery, fortunately, had this chance for the first time after 35 years to go to Iran. We need that. And you have lots of restrictions, I think, and also, but I think Obama administration, Obama himself has enough courage to initiate something. What he did to call Mr. Rouhani, you know that we have lots of problem in Iran. Even when Mr. Rouhani went to Iran, after answering his call, many people, threw the shoes against him, in front of him in airport. We have many problems, but we have in our culture, for example, in Muslim community, just one example. If you said salam, I have to answer you. Obama called Mr. Rouhani and he had to answer it. Mr. Karoubi is in house arrest, my previous boss in Majlis. He came here, he didn't have any planned meeting with congressmen, many American officials. But some, Iranian American guys offered him in UN. Can you talk directly to this congressman, this senator? He mentioned, and they want to say to you hello. He mentioned, yes, we have in our culture, we should, we have to, respond. If somebody said salam, we should salam alaikum, we should say salam alaikum. And they started, after that they asked the senator and many congressmen, they asked Mr. Karoubi, can we talk more and sit? And they didn't have plan to talk to each other, and somebody brought some chair and talking. So this is all, this is very, very tactical problem. Very, we have, and also the sanctions that we have right now. That many people, friends here, I think they know that I'm advocating since 2009 to relieve the sanctions on the ICT stuff, internet freedom, and this kind of, and we had lots of achievement. But right now we have much more difficulties to convince the administration, Mr. Cohen, to relieve this sanction, to expand backbone of internet in Iran. Right now, Mr. Rouhani has the big tender, is going to have, I think it's a revolutionary project called Tadbir one of his slogan, to expand backbone of the internet in Iran. We couldn't even until today convince Mr. Cohen to relieve this sanction and allow all US company to sell this equipment to Iranians to have access to information. So communication and this exchange, it would be very, very important, and I hope that US can start and initiate these initiatives, and you can see what happens after that, I think.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Jim.
Ignorance and fear are the enemies of peace, and President Eisenhower was a big believer in people-to-people diplomacy. I am too. I believe that we should have exchanges immediately between members of the Majlis and members of the United States Congress. We should get to know each other and tear down these walls of fear and ignorance that exist between these two countries. And the way to do that is for people to talk to each other. One of the things that's been stunning to me, frankly, is that in dealing with this administration and talking to the people that are involved in these negotiations, they don't know any Iranians. They don't have any acquaintances across the table. And this is, for goodness sakes, 2015. And I mean, this is the fruit of isolation. And it's just ridiculous in this modern era. To your question, let me just clarify that when I talked about Christian Zionism and the rising influence of it within the Christian fundamentalist community, I'm just pointing out that this is a very significant factor and force in Republican primary politics. And I am only pointing that out because as we get deeper into the election process, these forces become more powerful and more influential. And that's why I'm suggesting it is so important for us not to move this June the 30th deadline. Focus on getting the job done on both sides by June the 30th.
Michael.
Look, I'll respond to these two questions, just though on this last point that Congressman Slattery made, I just think it's worth saying again that I think the concerns that people have about Iran in the country are widespread. I mean, you see polls which suggest, 67 or so percent. I just don't think it's a matter of a small sort of special interest which is trying to skew things.
Not suggesting that.
And I think, frankly, that to the extent sort of the Christian community has those views, they're widely shared. Yeah. On the missile question, let me just say I think it has been a mistake on our part not to insist that the missile question, that Iran's ICBM development as well as its space launch activities, for example, be addressed in these negotiations. I mean, if you just recently, I think the head of Strategic Command, U.S. Strategic Command, talked about North Korea potentially now having the ability to hit the western coast of the United States with mobile ICBM launchers. This is one of the most serious types of threats that our country can face. And obviously a long-range missile program is part of any nuclear weapons program. And so keeping it off the table, which we did because the Supreme Leader set it as a red line, refused to talk about it, I think was not the right strategy to take. The GCC Leaders Summit, which is supposed to happen at Camp David, and now there's been a date set. Look, my worry, if I were sitting in the NSC as an NSC staffer, would be that we're not prepared for this summit. Whenever you get leaders together, it's very important that you have that the meetings be successful. And I just worry that we haven't done the spade work, number one, to really understand and address the concerns that our allies in the region have. You've in fact seen, I think, some statements which have gone in the opposite direction, which have done the opposite of sort of reassuring our allies that we in fact are on the same page as they are when it comes to interests. And second, I don't think that we know what our program is for countering and deterring Iranian behavior after a nuclear deal is signed. So I don't know that we know what we're going to put on the table. And I think it's dangerous when you have this kind of summit without first doing that sort of diplomatic and staff spade work at the lower levels to understand what should these leaders be talking about and what can they come out of the summit having agreed upon, because the worst thing I think you can have is a summit that's considered a failure. I think that sets us back. And so I think we need to do more work. We need to be patient. We need to do that work at the working level before we do it at the leader level. And I just don't see that yet.
Howard, last word.
I think the question was, if there is a deal, are there opportunities for a larger U.S.-Iranian area of cooperation?
Yeah, specifically against ISIS, because it seems there's, within our Arab allies, although officially they're against it, as we've read, there's significant support. And others, by the way, not just ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Syria, for example, those groups, that because they're against Iranian interests, may be tolerated.
Well, I could see a situation. It's not that I could see it. I could conceive of it. It would be nice to see it. Does the Iranian leadership decide that we should try a different approach in Syria to deal with these threats than the one of simply propping up and arming Assad? Is there room for Iranian role in a successor leadership that represents the elements of Syrian society and that works to isolate those forces? I mean, there could be opportunities. The one thing I remember, we've had this period of incredible tension with the regime in Iran for many, many decades. Every information I've seen about polling, to the extent you can do polling in Iran, the Iranian people are more pro-West and pro-American than many of the people in other countries in the Middle East. I came up with a theory: the more estranged we are from the government, the better the people like us. The closer we are to the government, the more they hate us. But I think we should always be willing to look at new opportunities, but not naively, you know. And I think that would make sense for any administration.
I want to bring this to a close. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to say that we look forward to seeing you at our next Iran Forum event, which will focus on Iran's role in the region. And please join me in thanking our panel this morning.